And Mike, thank you, and good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to be back in front of you this morning, even though it means we don't get a chance to listen to Roy. You do get a chance to listen to me, and more importantly, I get a chance to finally stand before you. It's been a long couple of months, and I am going to take the opportunity to thank especially the ladies for all of the cards and programs that I've received over the past several weeks. It's definitely been a great blessing to me, and definitely brightened up some pretty dark spots in my life. Some of the things I've gone through medically in the last several months, and so thank you all for that. I don't know how familiar any of you are with the book Alice in Wonderland. But there's a section in the book where Alice is talking to the Cheshire Cat. And I have to admit, Cheshire Cat is probably one of my favorite characters in the book. But she's talking to the Cheshire Cat, and of course he's sitting in a tree, and Alice asked him, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" The Cheshire Cat replied, "Well, that depends a great deal on where you want to get to," said the cat. And Alice said, "I do not much care where." And then the cat replied, "Then it doesn't matter which way you go." When you think of it, that's kind of a good wisdom on its face, don't you? But unfortunately, many of us live our lives in such a, let's say, disconnected way that Alice seems to exhibit here. And what we're going to talk together about this morning is the difference between living life on purpose and living life with God's purpose. Now, the dictionary defines purpose as the reason for which something exists or is done, made, or used. And when you think about it, it's a question that many people have in today's society is, what is my purpose? Both as a person, perhaps as an employee, as a family member, is what am I meant? What am I have been put here to do? What is my purpose? But we're not going to look at it in so much that sense this morning, as we're going to look at it on what is purpose doing in my life. Now, when you think about it, the idea of living life on purpose, that is having a reason why you do things, that's something I think we all do. Matter of fact, I know for a fact it's something we all do. You know how I know that? By virtue of the fact we're all here this morning. Is in order to come here this morning, is you had to prepare yourself, didn't you? You had to get up at a certain time to give yourself time to get dressed, to get ready, to come to services. You purposed in your heart, if I can use that expression, that you would make it here to services. And of course, we're all happy to have you. But when we look at the idea of living life on purpose, I think we can agree that purpose is powerful. And we look at the other sense of those who are not here with us this morning is, of course, there's many different reasons, but a lot of the reasons have to do with the fact they just don't want to come. In other words, that purpose that you have or had this morning to come to services to worship together with us is not present in their life. It's that reason why we do things. And I think we all can agree that that's one thing that certainly we need in our life, is we need the reasons why we do things. We need a purpose. But the question I want to ask us this morning, each of us this morning, is what if we stop living life on purpose, started living life in purpose? Now here's what I mean by that. When you got up this morning, and you decided, for instance, what you were going to have for breakfast. Let me ask you, who did you consult about that? Well, if you're married, I guarantee you probably consulted your spouse, or at least if you're a husband, you consulted your spouse. But most of us, I think we made that decision for ourselves, whether we wanted some cereal or eggs or whatever. And we decided, based on that purpose, to go ahead and perform or get whatever it is we purposed in our hearts to eat, right? Let me ask you, does God care about what you ate for breakfast? Does He care about what color shirt you put on, what color tie you put on? No, there's some things that when we think about our purpose, in other words, why we choose those things, is that we're left up at our own devices. God leaves it up to us. But are there some things in our life that God does care about the decisions that we make? Well, again, one of the reasons we know this is because we are all here this morning, is we know that it pleases God that we come together to worship Him. Now, when you think about those who, and I'll use the example of some people that I've talked to that have said, well, it doesn't really matter where I worship God, is I can go worship Him out in nature. And so what they do is they sit at home in front of their television waiting for the football game, and it says, well, I can worship God from my living room. But when God says to come together as a congregation to worship Him, what did He mean? Well, exactly that. He wants to see us. Matter of fact, what does the writer of Hebrews says? That we're not to what? To forsake the assembly, as is the manner of some. What was missing in the some is not an understanding. They knew where God wanted them. They knew what God wanted them to do. What was missing was the purpose. And what happened is their purpose became fixated on themselves. In other words, it was a selfish purpose rather than conceding to God's purpose. And that's what we're called on here this morning to do. Is it's not that we are just to live life on purpose, but we want to live life for His purpose. We have many examples of this in Scripture. And the one I wanted to focus on this morning has to do with Esther. And you look at Esther's life, especially the very first parts of it, it's a study in the difference between living life on purpose and living life in purpose. Because the decisions that Esther makes, for instance, when she first is raised to the queenship of the nation, is one of the decisions she makes is that even though she is a Jew, is what did her and her uncle Mordecai decide to do? Remember, it said they were going to hide that fact. Why? Well, because they were worried that it was going to cause issues for her. And so they basically didn't tell anybody that she was a Jew. And this would come up later in the story. And all of the things that she did up to that point were basically because of this sort of decision. And when she looks at the circumstances that arose, and what happened is there was a man in the court named Haman who just didn't like the Jews. And the reason he didn't like the Jews is because he thought they didn't pay him enough respect. And so Haman purposed in his heart that he wasn't just going to get back at Mordecai, who had offended him personally, but he's going to get back at the entire Jewish race. And what he decided to do is to trick the king into proclaiming that everybody had to worship the king or else be executed. Now you can imagine, this caused some consternation for the Jews. As a matter of fact, book of Esther tells us, that the Jews got together and they proclaimed a fast and a mourning because they thought for sure that they were all about to be killed. The thing is, though, is they had somebody in a high station who could plead their case, didn't they? They had Esther. Why didn't Esther do that right off the bat? Why didn't she, as soon as she heard about that proclamation, why didn't she go to her husband and say, "Husband, I'm a Jew, and this thing that Haman's about to do is going to affect both my people and me"? It's because she was scared. And that's something we can understand, can't we? You ever been scared to do something because of the consequences? Now, sometimes that's a good thing, isn't it? For instance, if you're about to commit a crime and you're scared of getting caught, well, it's a good thing that it keeps you from doing that, isn't it? But aren't there some times in which there are good things that we should be doing that we don't do because we're scared of either how it's going to be perceived, or what other people are going to say, or how it's going to affect us, or it might put us in a negative light with some people? Because let's face it, does everybody always appreciate the good things we do? No, of course they don't. Let me ask you though, does that mean we don't do those good things? See, that's the difference between living life on purpose and in purpose. Living life on purpose, when I make those decisions, is I decide, okay, how is it going to affect me? And that's what Esther was thinking about with regards to what was going on at the time. Okay, if I tell everybody I'm a Jew, there's going to be a negative reaction because not everybody in the kingdom loves the Jews. And so if I tell them I'm a Jew, there's going to be issues. But think about it. If she didn't tell them she was a Jew, what was going to happen? Well, they were all about to be killed. And as we read in Esther chapter 4, the passage that you have in your outline there, verses 11 through 16, is what happens is Mordecai sends to Esther telling her the reason why everybody's in mourning. And Esther's reply is this, says, well, I can't go in to see the king because if I go in to see the king and he hasn't invited me, he can have me executed. What is the rationale? Again, she's scared, isn't she? And she's worried that if I do this thing, even though it's going to help my people, yet I stand in danger of losing my life for it. And so she's scared. And she sends that message to Mordecai saying, well, I can't go see the king like you want me to because if I do it unannounced or uninvited, he might have me executed. And in verses 11 through 16 of Esther chapter 4 tells us Mordecai's reply. At the very end of Esther's reply to Mordecai, it says, all the king's servants and the people of the provinces know that if any man or woman goes into the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, that they are to be put to death, except for to one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called in to come to the king for these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. And this is what Mordecai replied to Esther. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether or not you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. We've talked before about an epiphany. An epiphany is that moment, and I think of it as an aha moment. But for a lot of people, it means a change in their life. And I think what happens here is an epiphany for Esther. Is all of a sudden she's going to move from living life on purpose to in purpose. And what is it that causes her to step out in purpose? It's the realization that if she does not act in accordance to God's will, that her people are going to suffer. And we read the response of Esther later on. She says, Esther replied to Mordecai, "Go and gather all the Jews that are found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and that I, my young women, will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Let me ask you this. Is Esther still scared? Of course she is. You know what? She's got reason to be. We think of, oh, well, she's his wife. He wouldn't have her put to death. Oh, yes, he would. That's why she's scared of him. So she is afraid of the consequences still. But what caused her to act in spite of those consequences? It's the knowledge what Mordecai told her. God has called you to do this. And when you think about it in our lives, that's an awesome reason why we do a lot of the things we do, isn't it? Why is it, for instance, that we resist trials, that we resist temptation so hard? Let me ask you, wouldn't it be easier just to give in to temptation? Of course it would. That's why there's so many people out in the world to do it that way. Is when temptation arises for them, they act according to their own whims and desires. But guess what? When we became a disciple of Christ, is what happened is we agreed to not live life by our own dictates and desires anymore, but rather to live by what God wants for us. Amen. Now the great thing about that is God wants what is best for us. And so when we live life according to His will, is we're going to find things going better for us. But you know what? It's an adjustment, isn't it? It takes not just an adjustment in your actions, but it takes an adjustment in your thinking. Because just as Jesus says, so a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Now what does that mean for us? That means if you want to change what you're doing in your life, what do you have to change first? You have to change your mindset. You have to change your thinking. And that's why I'm bringing you this lesson this morning. And this, just like all the other lessons I bring, this isn't really intended for, say, a target audience. In this case, the target audience is, again, myself, because these are issues that we all struggle with. And that's why I'm talking to us about us this morning. Is because the entirety of our lives, as we struggle, just as Paul talked about in the book of Romans, when he talks about the dichotomy that is inside of us. And it is more than just, by the way, good wolf or good dog versus bad dog, as some have put it. In other words, the desire to sin versus the desire to do righteousness. And that's the way it's expressed, but have you ever thought that it goes a lot deeper than that? It's not just the desire to do good or to do bad, because there's plenty of people out in the world that desire to do good. Just as we know there's plenty of people in the world that desire to do evil. What's the difference between them and us? Is our desire is to be pleasing to God. Now, how does that change us? Well, what it means, first off, is that when we make decisions, it's more than just us making the decision on behalf of ourselves. Is how do we make those decisions? Well, we do it by, first off, learning God's will. And, of course, here's the practical aspect to this morning's lesson. If you want to learn God's will, what do you need to be able to do? You need to be able to read about it. Now, fortunately for us, is God has put into His Holy Scriptures, remember, everything, what did He tell Timothy? Everything what? Pertaining to life and righteousness. In other words, everything you need to know about how to be pleasing to God is found in your Bible. Amen. If only we would read it, not just read it, but as Roy is fond of saying, read it and what? And do it. Right? When we read it and do it, what does that do? Well, guess what? It opens up all of those blessings. Jesus said, I came that they might live life and that life more abundantly. And yet there's so many people, and I've had Christians complain to me about this before, saying, you know what? Jesus said I could have the abundant life, but my life doesn't feel very abundant. And here's the thing, as Christians, we know that it's not a one-time or not thing, is it? In other words, we live the abundant life or we're not. There are times in my day where part of my day I feel like I'm living the abundant life, and other times of the day when I feel like I'm living nothing but. Let me ask you, what changed? Did Jesus change? Did His promises change? Does what God offer us change? Does the love of God go away because I stop believing in it or lose connection with it? No, it remains there. What happened? What happened is I moved away from it. And what happens when I move back? Then that connection is restored. Those blessings are restored. But again, here's where the shift in thinking comes, because the abundant life it means something different for us than it does for those in the world. When those in the world think of an abundant life, what do they think of? They think of material blessings. That's why there's filled with so many stories about how God ought to be sending us checks in the mail or giving us. Remember back in the 80s, the craze was the golden fillings in the teeth in some places? Why would people think that God was going to fill their mouth with gold? For one thing, what good is that going to do? It's because people in the world are fixated on those material things. But rather, what are the blessings that we've been promised? Have we been promised lives of ease and luxury once we become Christians? Well, brothers and sisters, are you living lives of ease and luxury now? You know, that depends on our circumstance, doesn't it? And that's, as Jesus says, time and chance happens to all people. But rather, the blessings we've been promised are spiritual blessings. And so when we have that abundant life, it's not a life full of ease and luxury and no wants and all of our desires are met. As a matter of fact, you know, in some cases it's kind of the opposite, isn't it? Talk about all of our desires are met. When I was a kid, you know what my desire to eat all the time was? Something sweet. You know what would have been the perfect dinner for me back in those days? If I could have chicken and rice preceded by chocolate cake and followed by chocolate cake. But then as I realized that sort of thing isn't good for me, you know what? And I'll tell you what, it's still a struggle, as it is for many of us. Just like this life is. Because even though we know where the will of God can be found, and many of us know what it is, we're like Paul. Paul said he had those two within us. He says sometimes he finds himself doing that which he knows to be wrong, and he finds himself not doing that which he knows to be right. And then what did he say after that? He said, "O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from this body of sin and death?" What was he talking about there? You know, it's a fact that as long as we live here on this earth in these mortal bodies, that fight between our will and the will of God, and that's really what it is. It's not just between good and evil. It's the fight between my will and God's will. Living life on purpose for myself and in purpose for Christ. That's the battle we all fight. But I'll tell you what is, how sad would things be if Paul left off that passage in Romans with, "O wretched man that I am," right? But fortunately for us, what's the next thing he says? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ. And he talks about how Jesus delivers us from that. Why? Because that's the answer. You want to have that peace that passes all understanding? Who doesn't? We all do. Even those in the world, you say, kind of like the woman at the well. Jesus says that I have water. And she said, what? She said, "Give me some of that water that I might not have to come here and draw ever again." It's because she was misunderstanding what he was saying. What water was he talking about? He was talking about the living water that flowed from him, and she understood it and would be talking about literal water. And so when we contemplate why we do things, our purpose, is what we want to be able to do is to learn, as Paul did, or was working on, and to say, not my will, but thine be done. Now, you know what? We all know how hard that is, don't we? It's a hard thing to say. It's easy to say, but, it's hard to mean, doesn't it? Because aren't there times in which you really want something to happen? I don't know how familiar you are with Robert Burns, but he had a poem. And part of the poem is talking about mice and men. He says, the plans of both mice and men oft go a-gangly. In our common vernacular, that would just mean that things never work out quite the way we intend to, do they? I can't begin to tell you how many times I've thought about, and I have definite plans for how I'd like things to go. And then something will happen to, let's say, throw a wrench in the mix, or something will happen to mess that up. And then I'll look back after the fact and realize that God had it turned out for me even better than I could have imagined. You know what? It takes faith to do that, doesn't it? It takes faith to see that. Because if I don't have faith, my eyes are shut. And I'm like that ship tossed about that James talks about. But when we live life in His purpose, is then we're going to be able to not just read in Scripture, but we're going to be able to see in our lives the times in which God has acted in order to bring us to His purpose. Now, what was the end effect for Esther? When she decided to set aside her fear and to do what God wanted her to do in spite of her terror, what was the result? God blessed it, didn't He? And God did it, so not only she had a victory over Haman, but they had a victory over all of their enemies. Now, you would think that maybe the Jews would think, well, why did we have to go through all that so that we could get that result? Well, guess what? That was part of God's plan. God worked it out that it would be most advantageous for everybody who believed in Him, for His glory. He's not the only one. Remember when Joseph's brothers came to appear before him? And when they found out who Joseph was, that he was really their brother, what was their reaction? Were they happy to see him? No, they were terrified. Why were they terrified? Well, what had they done to Joseph back some 20 years before? Remember, they had sold him into slavery and tried to kill him, right? And so when they realized that it was Joseph, as they were in terror until he told them what? Basically, don't worry. He said, you intended this to me for evil, but what? But God has brought it out for good. And when you think about it, think of all the people to whom that benefited. Not just Joseph, not just his brothers, not just his father's family, but all the people in Egypt and indeed all the people in the world at that time, because of the circumstances that God placed Joseph in spite of all the trouble that Joseph went through. Remember, thrown in prison, accused of rape, about to be executed. In spite of all of that, what God was doing was putting Joseph in a position in which God would be able to bless everybody. Now, if we could see the results of our actions, it'd be a lot easier for us to make better decisions, don't you think? In other words, if Joseph went into that knowing that well, you know what, if I just keep faith with God and hold on, that this is going to benefit a whole lot of people. But you know what, did Joseph know any of that? What did Joseph know? He knew, as the beginning of Hebrews tells us, that God is and He is a rewarder of those who seek Him. And you know what? That's enough to start with, isn't it? Because as we move forward in faith from that promise, that's the beginning of us acceding to God's will. Not my will be done, but thine. There's a song we sing, isn't there? Starts off with saying that all of self and none of thee. And gradually throughout the song it transitions, doesn't it? Until the end of the song is what? The end of the song is none of self and all of thee. And we think, as Christians, what an awesome place to be. Let me ask you though, are we ever going to get there? I call your minds to what Kevin read for us this morning from that passage in Philippians. Because what Paul's talking about there is he's not there yet. He says, I'm not yet perfected. I'm not yet made perfect. And what he means by that is complete. In other words, he's not saying he's not sinless. What he's saying is, I'm not where I want to be. But that he's doing what? He's pressing towards that upward call of Christ. And that's the call for all of us this morning. Because that's where we're all at. We are all on that journey somewhere. And the way to make that path easier for us and to have the blessings that God has set out for us is, as Paul said, is to make His will ours. And as we know, though, it's not easy. It's a struggle. One of my favorite analogies for this has to do with the Bible character Jacob. Have any of you ever read Jacob's prayer remember Jacob's ladder? Remember when Jacob was going to his uncle Laban's house and he laid down his head on that rock? And the angels, he saw a ladder of angels ascending and descending into heaven. And it said that Jacob prayed a prayer then. And what do you suppose Jacob prayed? If you remember, what he prayed was this: Lord, if you were with me, then I will serve you. Imagine seeing a bunch of angels ascending and descending heaven, and here you are down on earth with your head on a rock trying to barter with God. It's basically what he's saying is, Lord, if you bless me, I'll follow you. And you know what? That's where a lot of us are at. And that's where I find myself in my life sometimes I'm at. It's because sometimes I get discouraged when things go bad and I say, well, you know what, God, where are you? As if bad things happening meant that God didn't love me anymore. But we know that He does. Later on in Jacob's life, though, as he begins to return from Laban's house, is he's got an issue. And the issue was when he left his father's house, and specifically his brother Esau, him and Esau didn't leave on very good terms, did they? What did Jacob just got through doing to Esau? Remember, he didn't just steal his birthright, he stole his blessing too. Until the point when Esau swore to do what to Jacob? He swore to kill him. That's why his family, his mother and father sent him to Laban in the first place, because Esau was going to kill him. And so when Laban's going to go back, what's the first thing he thinks about? What am I going to do about Esau? And here's where those best laid plans go a-gangly again. Because what happens is Jacob lays his own plans. I have to admire in a way, as I'm the same way. I have a goal I want to get to, and so I make plans to get to that goal, right? That's not bad. But if I don't include God in my thinking, what happens? My plans are going to be futile. And so were Jacob's, because Jacob's first plan is this. He says, well, I will placate Esau, and I'm going to send him gifts so that he won't be so mad at me. So he sends the gifts to Esau, and what does Esau do? He sends the gifts back. And right off the bat, Jacob knew he was in trouble. And so Jacob, rather than turn to God yet, he's going to make another plan. What he says is this. He says, well, when Esau comes to kill us, we're going to divide us into 3 groups. That way Esau can only kill part of us, and the other 2 parts will get away. Only what happened on the night before Jacob met Esau? Remember, God came and wrestled with him. The angel of the Lord came and wrestled with Jacob. And what did the angel of the Lord do to Jacob during that wrestling match? He dislocated his hip. How many of you ever dislocated something? I'll tell you what, you are not going to run very far or very fast on a dislocated hip. See, what God was doing is he was removing all of the on purpose in Jacob's life and pointing him to his purpose. And when we become fit servants of God, that's what God does to us as well. He forms us into what he wants to us, what he needs us to be, not for our glory, but for his glory. This morning we talked about the sermon of Stephen. One of the bits in the sermon of Stephen is a little interesting bit about Moses. It seems that when Moses was back in Egypt as a prince of Egypt, Moses thought to himself that he was in the perfect position to lead the children of Israel up out of Egypt. Now, in the end, what was going to happen? Well, exactly that. Moses was indeed going to lead the children of Israel up out of Egypt. But why didn't God use Moses early in the first 40 years of Moses' life, when Moses was in a powerful political position, part of a powerful family, when he very easily could have done some of that, and instead had Moses go through all the things that he did? It's because God had a purpose. But Moses didn't know that. Moses thought is that he was unworthy. That's why he flees to Midian. That's why when God appears to him and said, "You're going to lead my people up out of Egypt," what was Moses' response? "Oh no, Lord, you don't mean me." Because all those years had taught Moses that his purpose wasn't going to work. And so what happens is God is going to conform Moses to his purpose. And so it is for us, as we're all living this life. And as Christians, that's our duty, is to try to somehow make God's purpose our purpose. And we don't know where it's going to go. We don't know what benefits it's going to have in our lives, in your family's lives, in the lives of this congregation, in the lives of this world. But you know what? I know for a fact is if when we begin to accomplish God's purpose rather than our own purpose, is positive things are going to happen. God will be glorified. So with those thoughts, the lesson is yours this morning. There's so many examples, not just in Scripture, but in our own lives as well. We can look back and see where God has been acting in our lives. And that's something that we hold on to. But this morning, the call for us as we can walk from this place is to remember, it's not my will, but his will be done. And so, excuse me, if you need to respond to the invitation, whether for prayers or any other reason, we invite you to come forward now as we stand and we sing.